Hey, so today we're going to jump into the book of Judges. Now, I don't know if I've told you guys this deep, dark secret in my past, but I actually used to rodeo. So I used to, when I was in junior high, I did junior rodeo, so I rode junior bulls and steers. Then when I got in high school, my dad wouldn't let me ride bulls, and I'm very thankful because that's the reason I'm alive. So I switched over and started steer wrestling, which is not as dangerous, even though it looks equally as dangerous. But anyway, the reason I tell you that is because I've always been a fan of bull riding, and some of you might be fans of bull riding, the PBR. And if you ever watch bull riding, you notice that there are some really good bucking bulls, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, just hang on, you'll get through it too. But what happens is with a really good bucking bull, they come out of the chute, if you notice, and they usually spin really fast, and while they're spinning, they kick their feet up, if you've ever watched PBR. Okay, but the really what are called rank, really good bucking bulls, also have a few tricks up their sleeve. And one of the tricks that a really good bucking bull uses is called reversing its spin. So what will happen is it'll come out of the chute, the cowboy will get in a rhythm, and he'll do like 3 spins to the left, the bull will, and so the cowboy shifts his weight to the inside of the spin. Well, then what will happen is the bull will just plant and switch it the other way. Which happens is the cowboy's going this way, and then when the bull does that way, he just shoots out. Okay, so it's called reversing their spin. It's a nasty trick, but the really good bulls do it. Well, as we go through the Old Testament, we're about to reverse spin. The biblical text kind of reverses its spin on us. We just finished Joshua, and although not extremely, not like perfect, the book of Joshua is a pretty positive book. It's a celebration of the fact that God kept his promise to Israel to give them the land, right? We ended with the focus on Yahweh's faithfulness to his promises. So everything's kind of spinning in the positive direction. Well, then all of a sudden we hit the book of Judges and the Bible reverses spin because we go from one of the most positive books into the Old Testament to perhaps one of the most bleak and ugly books in the Old Testament. And some of you know what I'm talking about because you remember your reading from last week, okay? And that is the book of Judges. So I've subtitled the book of Judges, The Dark Days in Israel. So a couple of quick things. Joshua died at the end of the book of Joshua. And what we have in Judges is these rulers, and they're called judges. Now when we think of a judge, what do we typically think of? You think of Judge Judy, somebody said that's good. We think of a courtroom scene. With the judge sitting on the bench with the gavel, right? And now, hear me, that's how judges typically functioned in ancient Israel. They did have judges and they did judge. They made judicial decisions in Israel. But that's not what is highlighted in the book of Judges. What is highlighted in the book of Judges is the judges are actually like military leaders. And so what happens is we get a series of these military leaders who God raises up to deliver his people. So let's talk about this book and what is the importance. What is the importance of the judges? Okay, so the first thing, let's talk about theme. The major theme of the book of Judges is Israel becomes like the nations. Israel becomes like the nations. Now, Daniel Block has probably the best commentary on the book of Judges. And he identifies the theme of Judges as the Canaanization of Israel. So what he's saying is Israel basically gets into Canaan and they become just like the Canaanites. Now, I need to unpack that a little bit. What's interesting is that even though Israel had conquered the land, had taken the land of Canaan, there were pockets of Canaanites all through the land. And in fact, Israel had failed to do what Yahweh commanded, and that is to drive out the Canaanites. So Israel and the Canaanites lived side by side. So as a result of Israel's failure to drive out the Canaanites, their punishment was Yahweh said, okay, you don't want to drive them out, then they are going to be basically thorns in your side. And so in other words, God just kind of gave them what they wanted. Now I don't know about you, but there's been many times in my life where I wanted something really bad and I got it. And then after I got it, it was like, uh-oh, maybe I didn't want that. And that's kind of what happens in the book of Judges. Israel didn't want to drive out the Canaanites. They failed to do so. So Yahweh let them stay, and they kind of reap the consequences in the book of Judgment. So, just like we talked about, What happens is instead of Israel influencing the Canaanites, guess what happens? The Canaanites influence Israel, and Israel becomes like the nations, which stands in stark contrast to the purpose of what covenant?
The Mosaic.
Thank you. Why does it stand in stark contrast to the Mosaic covenant? Because God told them in the Mosaic covenant that his intention was for them to be what kind of nation? Holy nation, which means set apart. Okay? Set apart nation. So instead of being set apart and different, they actually just adopt the practices of the Canaanite. Now, this theme is highlighted in two distinct sections of the book. The first most of the book is the part we're familiar with, and that is chapters really 3 through 16. And in 3 through 16, we get what are called the cycles of rebellion. It's actually two. It starts in 2, but chapter 2 really kind of outlines the cycle, and then we really pick it up basically in chapter 3. Okay? I think. Yeah, 3:7 is when we start. So the cycles of rebellion. Now, you guys know this, so walk me through it. Israel's cycles of rebellion, by the way, there's 6 of these, and each cycle is tied to one of the judges. So there's 6 major judges in the book. Some of them are very familiar with us. 6 major judges, and each judge gets their own cycle. But how does each cycle begin? Thank you. What kind of sin? Idolatry, yes. Idolatry. So each cycle begins with idolatry. Now, can anybody tell me, this should be pretty easy, the 2 favorite gods that Israel worshipped, especially in Judges? Baal and, do y'all remember Asherah? No, okay. So Baal is the Canaanite fertility god. I think have I mentioned this before? Yes, no, help me. Okay, who was associated with storms, and they associated the gods with the fertility of crops. So Baal would bring the storms that would water the crops and then produce water the ground and produce the crops. Yeah, I would say even for us, that's always our tendency, is to drift from what is right. I would say it's just our sinful hearts. We would rather do it our own way instead of submit. And so for them to worship Yahweh alone would be submitting to his rules, whereas with the Canaanite practices, by the way, the Canaanite worship practices, especially Baal and Asherah, were driven by fertility cults, which is high levels of sexual. They would have temple prostitutes and stuff. So you can see how it's a little more attractive because it's driven by pleasure, kind of like our culture. So some things never change. We worship sex just for sex. They worship sex as part of their gods. They would worship gods via sex, is how that works. Does that make sense? So yeah, I mean, I would just say it's the condition of the human heart. We always prefer to rebel against the Creator. So, which is why it's so hard to live a righteous life. And that's why Jesus said, narrow is the gate, few enter it. Because it is hard. It's only by God's Spirit that we can do it. So, good question. All right, so Baal was the main god they worshiped, but there was Asherah, who was oftentimes associated with a tree or a pole. In the Old Testament, we hear about Asherah poles, and they were like these, almost like these totem poles they would set up at a worship site. There's some mystery surrounding it. But Asherah was actually El was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. So Asherah was his consort, or his wife, and they had 70 children, and Baal was one of their children. Okay, so that's the worldview of the Canaanites that Israel's stepping into. And so those are the 2 favorite ones that are mentioned in Judges, Baal and Asherah. Okay, so they would worship them, and by the way, they would worship them because they were in their culture, right? And we're going to come back to that. Then the second step would be what? What would happen after they started worshiping? Idols. What would you expect would happen after they start worshiping idols? Somebody said, I think. Yes, judgment. And how did God judge them in the book of Judges primarily? Yes. He would basically judge them by means of their enemies. Subjugation to their enemies. So judgment by means of enemies. So this is where oftentimes it was their neighbors. So you remember Samson, who did he fight a lot? Philistines, and the Philistines were to Israel's southwest. Also, you'll hear like the Moabites and the Ammonites, which those were to the east of Israel, and so it was usually their neighbors who they were always fighting with in the book of Judges. So what would happen is God would allow their enemies to overrun them as a means of judgment. This sound familiar? This is just what we saw with Israel and the Canaanites. It's just being reversed. Israel's on the receiving end of judgment now, and God's using their enemies to judge them. Okay? Then, what would happen? Israel would then do what? They would cry out, right, for deliverance to Yahweh. Isn't that true of our lives, right? When do we oftentimes cry out to God? When things are bad. For many of us, God is nothing but a spare tire. And that's exactly how He was to Israel in the book of Judges. They would pull Him out when they needed Him, when they were at their lowest. Okay? And then the last one is, so they would, idolatry, judgment, crying out to Yahweh, and the last one would be what? This is where the judge comes in. God would raise up a judge and He would deliver them. So deliverance by a judge. And again, this happens 6 times in the book. Two points on this. One is this. What scholars have pointed out about the book of Judges is this cycle is not just we might say it's actually more of a downward spiral than a true cycle. And what that means is that each time Israel goes through the cycle, they get a little worse. So it's not like they're just staying even. They get worse every time. And in fact, that is represented by their judges. Their judges start either morally neutral or kind of good, and then by the end, you're left with Samson, who is very morally corrupt. He's got he gets in a lot of trouble with women, put it that way. And so we get this moral corruption that even is represented by the judges who deliver Israel, okay? So the book is just down the toilet, basically, is how the book does. The second thing is when we look at this, what does this again remind us about as far as God's character? Yes, merciful, right? I mean, you figure the first 3 times, okay, I'll give them, like your parents, I'll count to 3, and that's it. But then there's 6 of these, and He still delivers them by Samson at the end with the Philistines. So this it highlights for us God's patience, I heard patience, and mercy. Because God, again, could have just been done with the people at any time, but He continues to deliver them, even though it seems like their crying out is just superficial, because they immediately return back to it. But before we look down on them, right, we could ask ourselves, how many times do we do this in our own lives? We regularly do this, and it's another reminder for us of how God's gracious and patience to us as well, which we should be very thankful for. Okay? Now, before we move to the end of the book, which is a bit graphic, let's first of all talk about 2 points related to this. The first thing is each cycle in the book of Judges is kicked off with a key phrase. Okay, and that key phrase at the beginning of each cycle is, anybody remember it? The key phrase at the beginning of each cycle? I'll give you a start on it. And the children of Israel, yes, there we go. The children of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. So key phrase at the beginning of each cycle is, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Now, and their primary sin again was idolatry. Now, I want to kind of draw home some implications for us here. We oftentimes, when we look at around us and we think about the evils of our society, I mean, there's a laundry list of things we can name. Sexual perversion, abortion, just greed, materialism, all these things that we can name, right, that are all around us. And usually when we think of evils, we think of social evils, right? But we're hesitant, I think, to label idolatry as evil. So think about it. I don't know. You guys might be resonating. Where I'm from, you have what's called, you call people good old boys, right? And what's a good old boy? A good old boy is just somebody who's, good-hearted, they're kind, or like Tim McGraw says, they're humble and kind, and they do good to their neighbors, they're good friends, they're loyal, and all these things. And here's the thing. We will call people good boys who have never even bowed the knee to Jesus Christ. And so here's what I would challenge you on, though. They're actually not good. In fact, if they are not worshiping Jesus, that's the greatest evil, right? Because that's breaking the first and the most important commandment. And so I think it's important for us as Christians to get a little shift in our focus. Social evils are evil. But I think sometimes we put more emphasis on saying those are evil than we do when people refuse to worship Jesus Christ. And in fact, biblically speaking, idolatry is far worse than social evils. In fact, biblically speaking, social evils flow out of idolatry. When we don't worship God first, then everything else is chaos. in our lives. So I just encourage you guys to keep in mind when God looked at what Israel was doing, and immediately following this phrase would be a description of their idolatry, he looks at it and says, that's evil. It was evil in the sight of Yahweh because why? They're not, living according to how he designed them, and that is to worship him, and they're rebelling against the King of the universe by not worshiping him as he could. Okay, now, in Judges, we have a tendency to be really judgmental towards Israel. So I want us to have a little bring it home time as a little discussion as a class. And so here's what I want to talk about is idolatry today. Since we just talked about how idolatry is a great evil, what does it look like today? So here's two questions I want you to talk about at your table for a few minutes, okay? Number one is, what does idolatry look like today? I mean, obviously we don't, in our culture we don't have Baal and Asherah. I don't know about you guys, but I haven't seen a temple to Baal in Branson. And then the other thing is, if you say it actually happens today, the second question would be, what are some of the major idols in American culture today? Okay, now the second one is really broad. So the second one is specific idols. The first one is like, how would you even identify it? How would you know if you were worshiping an idol in our culture? Everybody good on that? Now the reason I want you to do this is because the reason Israel worshiped Baal and Asherah is because Baal and Asherah were the idols in their culture. So if we're going to worship idols, guess what idols we're going to worship? Idols in our culture. We're not going to go worship an idol that Europe might have a problem with. We're going to worship an idol that our culture, the people around us, have a problem with. So I want us to really do some examination. So go ahead, discuss these, and we'll talk about them briefly as a class. Go for it. So let's start first one. What does idolatry look like today? So we tie it to the greatest commandment. If there's an area of our life where we're not loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, that means our affections are divided. So whatever that is might be it, okay? Does anybody talk about any specific indicators, like a deep desire for? Yeah. Can we use the word obsession? Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. I like it. Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, like, is your end goal God? Yeah. If it's not, then you got an idol, right? Yeah. That's great. Yeah, thanks. With time, does that mean that we just measure up our day, we clock our day, like we keep a logbook of our time, and whatever uses the most time, that's our God? Why not? Well, first of all, I can tell you, you want me to tell you guys? I think if you kept a logbook, most of your time would be devoted to, and I know for sure most of you aren't tempted to have school as an idol. Like, I can just go and tell you that, right? And you guys are like, amen. Okay, so here's how this works. You can spend a lot of time doing something and still do it as an act of worship to God. It's we're spending time for stuff that's not reflecting back on God, that's not exalting Him, that's not being done for His glory. Okay, right? Does that make sense? So that was a great kind of tag team duo there, guys. So that's it. So let me give you, I don't want to take up time, I wanted you guys to share, but let me give you some other indicators. So we've got time, and if you want some T's, here's a good way to do this. Time, I would use the word treasure. What do you treasure the most in life? Okay? What is most valuable to you? And if you don't know what's most valuable, ask your friends. They'll tell you what's most valuable to you. Why? Because what's valuable to us, we do what? Talk about it, right? So time, treasure, so I would say your thoughts. Now in particular, I hope in this class you're thinking about worldview when you're in here. I'm not gullible enough to believe that everybody is. I mean, we all daydream. But oftentimes, I heard one scholar put it this way, it's oftentimes what your mind drifts to when you're in neutral. So think about, like, for me, one of the gauges is when I lay down to go to sleep, where does my mind drift? That might be an indication of what I'm loving, delighting in, treasuring, right? On that, okay? And then one other one I'll give you is another two would be trials. So here's what I mean by this. Oftentimes, like for Israel's culture, they would turn to these idols for a sense of comfort and security. And when do we seek comfort and security the most? When things feel like they're getting chaotic, when it feels like we're hitting trials. So the question is, what do you turn to first when you're in a trial? Might help you understand what an idol is in your life as well, okay? So the bottom line is, if you want to think about it, whatever your identity is formed around, that is your God. So if your identity is formed around Christ and His kingdom, then that's a good checkpoint on what you're following. If your identity is formed around something else, that's might be an indication that's an idol in your life. Okay? And by the way, we shouldn't make it a practice to go around and try to tell everybody else what their idols are. We should be constantly examining our hearts, because that's where idolatry starts, is in the heart. And checking our thought life and our heart patterns to see if we are worshiping God in all things and for His glory for all things, okay? All right, now let's get to the part that everybody loves, and that's what are some specific idols in our culture? Celebrities. Good? Technology is huge, right? I could go on my technology rant, but I'll hold off. Technology is huge. We're controlled by it. If you want a good book on that, oh man, what's his name? The book's called Technopoly. Gosh, what's his name? He wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death. Anyway, that's the name of the book. Just look it up. Power. Interesting. Yeah, we do like control, don't we? Money's huge. And really, any relationship can quickly become an idol, right? Oh, like social media and stuff? Well, let me help you. Here's how we do it. Because in our culture, we oftentimes are guilty of groupthink. And groupthink happens when we identify strongly with a certain group or movement more so than we do with Christ. Does that help? So it doesn't matter if it's the best movement possible. If your identity becomes formed around that movement, then you've got an idol. And then usually we're accompanied at that point with groupthink, which you see in politics all the time. Oh, cell phone. Yes. So, okay, I'll do it. So what would you call a person who walked around with a jar of whiskey all the time, looking at it? Okay, what would you call a person who walked around with a plate of food all the time, eating every time you saw them? A glutton. That's what you would call them, a glutton, right? But what do we do in our culture? We walk around like staring at this little device or being on it all the time, and it's acceptable, right? Yeah. Again, this will apply to anything. Like addictions are a form of idolatry, right? And so if you can't step away from your cell phone for an extended period of time, then you might have an idol because it's addiction. And then if you couple that with social media and people finding their identity on how many likes they get, you're really getting at the heart of idolatry. It's ruining us. It's ruining us. That's right. Thank you, ladies, for bringing that up. Okay, good. Yes, grades can become an idol. Thank you. Yes. In our culture, so self-centeredness has always been a thing, but I mean, again, I'm not a history expert, so I don't want to make too big of a statement here. But it's just crazy how much self-centeredness is not a vice. It's actually a virtue in our culture. Like if you listen to like pop culture or athletes, whoever said, nobody said athletes. That was mine. You listen to people and they can be just self-obsessed, just arrogant, and people love them. I'm like, in many cultures, you know what? That's just plain out nasty, and nobody would be around you. But in our culture, people love arrogance. I don't know why. I do know why. It's because, again, me is God for many people. So, all right. Are all the things that we name bad? No. Inherently evil? No, they're not. There's nothing inherently wrong with many of the things we name. I would argue the self-centeredness is pretty much the essence of sin. But other stuff is not inherently evil. So what happens is most of our idols, please hear me, are good things that we make ultimate. Do you hear me? This is important. It's not, if you go and you're addicted to sex, right? That's clearly wrong. Everybody's knowing that. Even though it's an idol, you're still sinful from the get-go. But it's harder for us to identify the idols that are good things, like relationships, right? Even technology, right? Technology makes this classroom a lot different than it would without it. You wouldn't have a PowerPoint and notes and all this stuff. Anyway, so there's all these good things, and when we make them ultimate, that's when they become an idol, okay? So you guys did a great job of identifying a bunch. I would add sports. As somebody who's tempted to make an idol out of sports, I have to put that out there. And if you watch Under Armour or Nike or ESPN, and you pay attention to their slogans, they are constantly putting sports as the answer to the world's problems. At which point they are saying sports is the best thing. It's basically identity forming. And so therefore they are promoting sports as an idol. So all of these things, we could keep going for days. Pleasure, we didn't talk about sex, pleasure, all that. That's just everywhere in our comfort. So we keep going. But I want to end by pointing out, again, that these are all things that we live and breathe. And it makes it very hard for us to identify them in ourselves because we are so entrenched in them. We have blind spots. So I just encourage you just to constantly guard your heart by using these gauges that we talked about. Now, Emma, one other thing. We hit kind of nationwide idols. There's also some specific idols in Branson. Or not just in Branson. I would say in this area in general. Okay, but what drives the shows? Music. Yes, but okay, no. What would be so we might say entertainment. So entertainment, or come back to celebrities, or even greed. Okay, one more that some of you know and you're afraid to say it. It's what unites Branson. Like if you go to many towns, you don't get this much of this. No. Patriotism. I would say in this area, America or patriotism is probably the number one idol. Again, hear me. Idols are good things. There's nothing wrong with being patriotic, but when it becomes ultimate, you just identified an idol, right? So those are the ones that are really close to home for us that nobody wants to call out, but we have to call them out, okay? The end of the book of Judges is very chaotic. Do y'all remember from your reading the other night? In fact, it's awful. It is so bad. And it's meant to shock us, okay? So here we go. The extent of Israel's evil is the last 5 chapters of the book are aimed at really driving home the fact that Israel's evil is just beyond the nations, really. I mean, they've gone off the deep end. So I don't have time to cover it all. So 2 points on this. The first one is I want to highlight the key phrase in this section. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, so 2 things about this. Notice the second part. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I don't know of a better description of our culture than this, right? So what that means is basically, it was just morality was a free-for-all. So it wasn't, notice the contrast. Their idolatry was what in God's eyes? Evil. And here we're seeing that they just did what was right in their own eyes. Now, here's how the prophets oftentimes condemned Israel on this. They would say that you call good evil and evil good. That's what the prophets would tell Israel. They're calling what God sees as good, they're calling that evil. And what God sees as evil, they're calling good. Again, this is like reading the newspaper. In our society, we call all kinds of perverse things good that God despises, and yet we call great evils like abortion a good thing, right? Or anybody who would ever try to speak for God, they're evil because they tell me that I'm wrong, right? That's how we've come to reverse, and that's exactly how it was in Israel's day. Everyone does what was right in their own eyes. And the second part, though, is this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. How do those two relate? What's this setting us up for? Yes, thank you. This is setting us up for the fact that the king is coming. And so it makes this causal connection between a lack of leadership, a lack of a king, and everybody doing what was right in their own eyes. Now we're going to ask the question, does the king actually solve that? But we'll talk about that in Samuel. So this is preparing us for the book of Samuel, which we're going to talk about the rest of the week. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is how bad it got. And there was a rated X story in your reading. Anybody remember this story? It's the story of the Levite's concubine. Okay, so this was in Judges 19, one of the most graphic, ugly stories in the Bible. And just so you guys, in case you didn't catch this in your reading, there is nowhere in the Bible that this story is being approved, right? It's used as an illustration to show how evil Israel has become and how chaotic things have gotten in their culture. And it is gross and gruesome. I don't think I need to retell it, but the Levite and his concubine come to Gibeah, which is in the territory of Benjamin, and they're out at the city square, and they're going to spend the night there, and this old man comes out and says, you better get out of the city square, come to my house. You guys remember it? Then the men of the city surround the house, and they want to have sexual relationships with the man, but instead he brings out his concubine. They ravage her all night long. She dies at the doorstep. Some of you didn't read. Okay. She falls at the doorstep, and then it's like, whoa, it gets crazier. He cuts her up into 12 pieces and basically ships her body parts to the 12 tribes. They then come and gather, and they have a civil war against Benjamin. I'm not making this stuff up, okay? The big question for all of us is, why? Why did the author of Judges include this story? That's what we want to answer. It's intentional. The authors choose their stories. There's a lot more stories that didn't make the Bible. Why this one? What's he trying to show? Does anybody recognize parallels of an earlier story in the Bible from this story? Lot. Yes. And what city? Sodom. Do y'all remember this? You remember when the angels visited Lot in Sodom, the men of the city surrounded the house and asked for the angels. They didn't know, well, there's debate over whether they knew they were angels. And instead, Lot offered his daughters. Bad move. But the angels struck the man blind, so nobody got hurt in that story. But the point is that what happened to Sodom? Yes, thank you. We all know what happened to Sodom. Fire from heaven consumed the city. So here's the point. If you didn't pick this up, this story is like a reenactment of Sodom. So here's what it's saying. It's saying that Gibeah, this town in Israel, is not just like the nations. They're actually like the worst of the nations. I mean, if you think of the worst nation possible, you would think of Sodom. And it's saying this little city is just like Sodom. So what's the point of the story? Gibeah equals Sodom and Gomorrah. Israel has become so wicked that they've actually bypassed the Canaanites, and they're more like Sodom and Gomorrah. At which point, what are we looking for as readers? Judgment. Fire from heaven, exactly. But it actually is interesting. God doesn't judge them directly. He judges them indirectly through the rest of the tribes coming. So it does show us a little bit of hope that there is somewhat of a moral compass, at least left in Israel. Now, the other why that you might have is, why did they cut her up in 12 pieces and send her? And the best smart aleck answer I can give you is what would you do if you got a body part in your mailbox? Get mad. Yes, and that's exactly what it did. It made them all mad, and they gathered for war. It was a war call.